Hello and welcome. This is a damn nerd here, and today we're talking about Florida State. Now, Florida State is considering leaving the ACC.
Foosball. You playing the foosball behind my back? You reap the fruit of your selfish ways. You gonna lose all your fancy foosball games.
And today we're going to talk about why, where we think they should go, and whether or not it's a good decision. So, this is the biggest decision ever facing the Florida State program. Should I stay or should I go? If I go, leaving a conference to go to another one can propel you more into the national spotlight. Look at Texas A&M, who was substantially more relevant in the Southeastern Conference than they ever were in the Big 12. But on the flip side, you have teams like Miami and Virginia Tech who were super successful in the Big East, but since going to the ACC have fallen into a black hole of mediocrity, or even in Miami's case, absolute disaster, from 5 national championships to barely any success in the Atlantic Coast Conference. So the decision Florida State makes will determine the future of the program. But before we get into what we think they should do, let's talk for a minute about why Florida State is so unhappy. Now, in 2016, the ACC negotiated a contract worth roughly $1.8 billion. Now, it sounds really nice, but then the ACC foolishly added a contract extension that runs through 2036. The problem is, while that was a good contract in 2016, it's a piss-poor contract in 2023. Meaning that ACC teams are very, very underpaid, even big and talented ones like Florida State. ACC teams can only look at around $40 million, while the SEC and Big Ten counterparts make almost $80.
And if you look at the numbers there, the Big Ten is projected to distribute about $80 million on average to their members, and the SEC about $72 million on average to their members. Right now, when you throw everything in, we receive about $42 million. So that would put us literally $30 million behind our competitors and peers across the country.
This means that the ACC teams are in significant jeopardy of falling behind. Now, in the case of Florida State provides 15% conference revenue to the ACC.
So I'll say this just because I wanted to point out that we contribute around 15%. If you take the ACC agreement and you look at what ESPN, what ABC, what all the media outlets measure, we represent 15% of the ACC's media agreement.
However, the Seminoles only receive 7% of ACC payout.
Florida State, but we only receive 7% of the distribution.
Meaning Florida State is losing a tremendous amount of revenue by being an ACC member. The Seminoles would actually make more money as an independent like Notre Dame. This has led to extreme frustration for the Seminole administration, as you need money to compete at the level of college football Florida State is playing. Losing a massive amount of money each and every year is going to guarantee Florida State slowly becoming a second-tier college football program. So the financial breakdown in this situation is 80-20, according to Florida State's athletic director.
The rule of thumb is 80-20. 80% of that media is going to be geared towards football, 20% towards basketball. That's just kind of when they go in with their variables and negotiate these deals, that's the numbers they're playing with.
The football program accounts for 80% of all revenue, while the basketball program has another 20%. Essentially, the other programs are basically useless. So for the ACC, which is considered to be primarily a basketball conference, it could be more difficult to negotiate a long-term multi-billion-dollar deal than it was for the SEC or the Big Ten. So if you look at it, Florida State makes about $45 million a year, according to Florida State's athletic director.
Right now, when you throw everything in, we receive about $42 million. So that would put us literally $30 million behind our competitors and peers across the country.
And that includes total revenue. That also includes its revenue the team just makes. However, the Southeastern Conference and Big Ten teams will be making substantially more just on TV revenue. So Florida State has been talking to the ACC. The goal for the Seminoles is to switch the ACC's model from an even payout across the board to a percentage payout based on how valuable you are to the conference.
We're working with the conference. Don't know if we're going to get there. Don't know if the revenue redistribution model will make that up. I know it won't make that up, but what can it make up? So they're working on options, but at the end of the day, for Florida State to compete nationally, something has to change.
This would mean that Florida State's take would increase from $17 million next year to $36 million based off the 15% revenue the Seminoles actually make for the conference, which is an increase of around $20 million, and would push the Seminoles' annual revenue out to about $65 million, putting them far closer to the Big Ten and SEC teams, which means the Noles could be more competitive. But I think even more damning here is if you look at this, you'll see also the Big 12 makes substantially more money than the ACC. This means that the conference that's about to lose Texas and Oklahoma and have no real football draw now makes more money than the Atlantic Coast Conference. And to add insult to injury, the Big 10, SEC, and Big 12 all go back to market before the ACC. This means they'll be able to negotiate another large deal. This number of, $30 million back for ACC teams is going to turn into $130 million back by the time the deal is renegotiated. This means that the ACC will become the joke conference that the media has tried to make it for the last 2 decades. Every team in the ACC will start to struggle to compete on any national level with this massive amount of loss of revenue. On top of that, the Big 12 is looking to poach the Pac-12, and since the Big 12 makes so much more money, it's possible. But you see, the Pac-12 does go back to market next year. Most likely will negotiate a new contract this year, which will likely put the Pac-12 well above the ACC as well. If they can't negotiate a good short-term multi-billion-dollar deal, then the Big 12 is going to poach and destroy the Pac-12 in order to try to save itself.
The Big 12 possibly going in and getting some teams, which would really leave the Pac-12 vulnerable for some other teams to be sitting in the open market.
And we're going to get to the effect on these conferences of these teams leaving later on. But first, I want to talk about the options the Seminoles have. Then we'll talk about the conference devastation. Florida State now is faced with one of 4 options because the Pac-12 is not a reasonable choice. The Pac-12 is a terrible choice. You can't afford to go across the country and play teams like USC every week. You'll start struggling every single week, and you'll have a very tough time being successful. So that leaves Florida State with staying in the ACC, going to the SEC, going to the Big 10, or going to the Big 12. We're going to look at it first with the ACC. For just the sake of argument in this video, let's assume the ACC comes up with the additional $20 million per year Florida State wants to stay. I mean, it is possible. It will force the other ACC teams to take somewhat of a pay cut. That's why these statements made by Clemson of solidarity with Florida State and North Carolina and Miami are not actually support. They're essentially saying that if Florida State gets more money, they want more money too, which puts the ACC in a tough bind, as if they have to pay all of those teams $20 million more a year. It means that the teams underneath are going to very much struggle to stay any kind of competitive. It will basically go back to what it used to be, where Wake Forest might win 2 games a year. And I don't know that Wake Forest is willing to take that much of a pay cut. However, if Florida State, Clemson, Miami, and North Carolina go to different conferences, that pay cut's coming anyway because the ACC will no longer be seen as any kind of idea of a football conference, and the new deal they negotiate in 2030 will most likely be much less than it would be had Florida State, Miami, North Carolina, and Clemson stayed. As good as Pittsburgh and Virginia Tech are, they're decent football programs, they can't carry a conference. So the first option is the ACC. Now, if the ACC comes up with the $20 million Florida State needs, should they stay in the ACC? Because if they don't come up with the $20 million Florida State leaves, you can cross the ACC out and say that the ACC is not even an option. It's just a matter of waiting until you can buy out and then going to whatever conference you choose out of the 3 that are interested, actually 4 that are interested.
If something's not done, we cannot be 30 million behind every year compared to our peers.
So if the ACC comes up with the money, I want to talk for a minute about some of the other cons of the Atlantic Coast Conference and some of its pros. So, one of the big cons with the Atlantic Coast Conference is its prestige. In spite of the success that both Florida State and Clemson have had in the last 10 years, with the exception of the 2 Willie Taggart years, the success that North Carolina has started to have, Virginia Tech has had success in the conference in the last few years. As a matter of fact, the ACC has won the second most national championships in the last 10 years, although the SEC has like 7 of the 10, so it's still kind of one-sided, but still, the ACC has 3 of the 10. So, with the success the ACC has had over the last 10 years, what the ACC has done very well in bowl games. It has 3 national championships. So, you would suspect the ACC would have more prestige nationally, but it doesn't. For some reason, the mainstream press has never given the ACC even the remotest amount of respect. If you look at most of the win totals, bowl game wins, even national title and playoff wins, you'll see that the ACC is by far the 3rd best conference, if not the 2nd best conference. You can make an argument between the Big Ten and the ACC, although the Big Ten only has 1 national championship in that 10-year period to the ACC's 3. I think that ends the argument and proves the ACC is a stronger conference. The thing with the Big Ten is it's very top-heavy. You end up with Michigan and Ohio State and literally nobody else. I'm sorry, Penn State fans, your team is very good, but when was the last time they played for a national championship, made the playoffs, or were even in the playoff hunt the last week of the season? It really is just a 2-team league, which is probably why the Big Ten is so eager to expand and poach ACC teams. So the ACC is a much better conference than it gets, but Florida State has to take the award for what it is, not for what we wish it was. So what it is the ACC has very little prestige, and it does hurt the Seminoles with recruiting. So that is a big con in staying in the Atlantic Coast Conference. Florida State would actually be able to build a stronger team should they choose to go to the SEC or Big Ten. Hell, they may be able to build a stronger team if they went to the Big 12, which for some reason actually seems to be more respected nationally than the ACC, even though the Big 12 is the worst Power 5 conference in college football without debate. All you have to do is turn on the last 2 playoff appearances, Oklahoma against LSU and TCU against Georgia, to see that the Big 12 right now doesn't even belong in the playoffs. I'm not even sure they deserve that Power 5 slot anymore. But in the real world, it's more about money, and the Big 12 generates a lot of money. So even though the teams are nowhere near good enough to actually compete on a national level, it does not matter. Plus, as you can see on this picture here, that's a 6-year TV deal. So even though Oklahoma, Texas are leaving, they still are locked into that deal for 6 years. So the Big 12 will still be making more money. However, on the plus side, Florida State dominates the ACC when they're good. I know the last 5 years have been rough, but 5 years hardly makes up for the fact that Florida State has won like 17 of 25 ACC titles since being in the conference. Overall, Florida State has pretty much completely dominated this conference since joining it. So leaving the ACC could be extremely difficult, as you have to get used to playing a whole different set of teams. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys that the SEC teams aren't better should Florida State choose to go there, but I am going to sit here and tell you the SEC is the most overrated football conference on earth. I'm not saying that the SEC is not the best conference, but the way the SEC fans act, you would think that Texas A&M should be an afterthought, but they've actually been far more successful in the SEC than they ever were in the Big 12. Same thing with Missouri. And in the long term, Florida State would also be far more successful in the SEC because it's a lot easier to recruit if you're an SEC team. Florida State already recruits at an elite level. With the SEC shield next to the name, plus an additional amount of money, the Noles would be able to recruit much better. But the ACC has familiarity, and I really only think one team is more synonymous with their conference than Florida State with the ACC, and that's Alabama with the SEC. I mean, there is no team, I think, if you think about the ACC, the first team that comes to mind will be Florida State, because it really feels like, for the majority of the 20-plus years Florida State's been in that conference, it feels like the conference has been the Seminoles. Plant the flag, freaking give us the crown. We are the best. Get over it. That is how it's been for the majority, not the complete time. I know a lot of Clemson fans might get mad at me for saying that, but I'm talking about the whole, like, 20-plus year period, not the last 5-6 years. Clemson has owned a conference for the last 5 or 6 years. And while the grip seems to be loosening, I don't think they've given up the crown just yet. So staying in the ACC has the familiarity and the fact that Florida State does feel like, to me, and I think to most people in the country, it feels like Florida State is back or going to be back this year or even next year to taking back control of the ACC. I feel like Norvell is a great coach. I feel like the team is recruiting better. We're building a football-only facility finally. We're still Florida State. And I really think that Florida State will take the ACC back over this year if Florida State chooses to stay in it long term. I won't be surprised if Florida State wins 7 of the next 10 ACC titles and makes 6 or 7 playoff appearances, because it feels like that's where the team's going. Now, I might be giving Norvell too much credit, but I really think he's the right guy at the right place at the right time to get Florida State back to national dominance. And so does Florida State, as they gave him a nice, fat, juicy contract I think a few months ago. That was like for $7 or $8 million per year. So Florida State has locked him up for quite a while. The university is bought in. Us fans have bought in. The players have bought in. Honestly, that's really about 90% of being a coach. Everyone buys in. People are going to do what you think is best, and a lot of times that's all you need. So staying in the ACC means that Florida State will likely continue the upward trajectory on the football field. However, you don't want to be like the Big 12, where you dominate the ACC, you win the conference every year, you go to the playoffs, and you get beat 45-0, because you're not really that good. It's just your whole conference is kind of weak. Also, with the fact that the SEC and Big Ten are expanding, it's unlikely you're going to be able to get a lot of big out-of-conference matchups in the future, which could really hurt the ACC nationally. So the national prestige means that even if Florida State receives that $20 million per year that they want, I still think the Seminoles should consider leaving the conference. Do you think the ACC holds Florida State back from being an even more dominant football program than they actually would be? So let's assume now, for the rest of this video, that the ACC is either unable or unwilling to come up with the additional $20 million Florida State wants. So Florida State is going to leave the ACC. Now, Florida State is facing a $120 million buyout, but that
Today, if using today's numbers, it'd be roughly $120 million.
Does go down annually. The longer Florida State waits, the less it will cost to pay the buyout. So we're going to look at the first and easiest option, and that is the Big 12. Now, the Big 12 is a reasonable option. It would bump Florida State's TV revenue up to around that amount they want from the ACC, somewhere in that 30 to $60 million range, depending on what they agree with the Big 12, which I'm assuming would be a higher number than most Big 12 teams make, because I'm pretty sure the Big 12 would be more than happy to get Florida State. And since Clemson has already said wherever Florida State goes, we're going to, you're also going to get Clemson. This would immediately fix the Big 12's issue of being non-relevant. Also, if the Big 12 was to get super lucky, you may be able to add North Carolina and Miami as well, making the Big 12 a more relevant football conference than it's ever been. Plus, with good teams like TCU and Baylor, the Big 12 could become a powerhouse conference with these teams added. So for Florida State, going to the Big 12, it's reasonable. It will give you a fairly large boost in TV revenue. The on-the-field Florida State would likely dominate the weaker Big 12 opponents who don't believe defense is a thing. The Seminoles will likely own the Big 12 from the day they join, just like they did with the ACC. And the Big 12 has more national prestige than the ACC. The only downside with going to the Big 12 is you're joining a conference that you are basically the flag bearer for. So if Florida State's good, the Big 12 is successful. If Florida State's bad, the Big 12 will struggle, just like with the ACC. Being the man has some pluses and negatives. Some of the pluses of being the man is you get to set the terms. You get to say, hey, look, I need more money. And people say, well, we need you, so we're going to find that money. But on the downside, there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot more expectation. Of course, Florida State's going to have a high expectation anywhere they go, but the Big 12 is going to be higher. Actually, I think the Big 12 would be higher expectations to the ACC, especially if Clemson, Miami, and North Carolina don't follow the Seminoles. Because now Florida State's in a conference that it looks very much like the ACC when Florida State joined it, with a lot of decent teams, but no real national championship competitors but the Seminoles. This could make it a little bit harder to make the playoffs consistently as well. And also on the negative side, you're inheriting the Big 12's recent prestige of playoff embarrassment. If it might hurt with recruiting against the SEC, but probably not. And the Big 12 would love it because Florida is literally the most successful high school football state in the country, with the majority of players drafted in last year's draft and the year before that draft coming out of the state of Florida. Now, I'm not talking about playing for the Florida schools. A lot of them go other places. But Florida State would allow the Big 12 to break in to the state of Florida and begin to recruit the state of Florida. This would truly help Big 12 members be more successful long term. It's a big reason that Oklahoma and Texas are headed to the SEC, because the SEC has so many more teams in that southern region that it will allow them to recruit more in the regions where the players are the best. Georgia and Florida are the best two states for high school football players, period. If you just look at the draft number breakdowns, you'll see both states do very well in the drafts every year. I can see why teams are going that way, but Florida State carries that with them. Florida State will never not be a big Florida brand, and that will help other Big 12 members recruit in the state of Florida. While they might not be able to go after the same guys Florida State is, you'll be able to be more successful. Plus, there'll be more games, more Big 12 games on TV in the state of Florida where most of the high school talent is, because the Big 12 teams will be playing Florida State more frequently. So the Big 12 is a good option. I personally wouldn't choose it. Personally, I don't think it's the right option. I think when you go to the Big 12, again, you're limiting the prestige of the team, and you're putting a lot on Florida State. And us Seminole fans will still have to deal with months of whiny ESPN pundits talking about how the Big 12 is just not that good. You're also putting yourself in the same position where you pretty much have to win all your games to actually get a shot to play in the playoffs. As a matter of fact, I say right now, you can lose one game in the ACC and get in, but you need to be undefeated in the Big 12. You're actually making your playoff attempts a little bit harder by going to the Big 12, because believe it or not, playing good teams like the SEC always complains about, we have to play so many good teams, is a lot easier than having to be perfect. It's really easy to lose to a team you're better than and be out of the picture if you're a Big 12 team. So that's my opinion on the Big 12. Let's talk about the Big 10. Now, there's a lot of positives with the Big Ten. One, the Big Ten members are looking at about $80 to $100 million. Now, not for the first few years of this contract. The contract pays out a little bit decreased for the first couple years due to some kind of standing TV deal with the SEC, which runs for one more year. And the first year, the contract doesn't pay out nearly as much, 2023, as it will in 2024 and 2025. However, the contract is 7 years, $7 billion. And thanks for those of you who pointed that out in my last video. I actually did not realize the Big Ten had signed a new contract till some people pointed out in my last video, but I had started researching this video and I found it's a 7-year, $7 billion contract, so it's $1 billion a year, and it comes out to $80 to $100 million for on average for every team in the conference. Now, you can imagine it's probably more like 60 for a team like Purdue and 120 for a team like Ohio State, but either way, it's a tremendous amount of money. Big Ten is now the highest paid conference we can assume. The SEC TV deal, the 10-year TV deal for the SEC, the total amount was not publicized. So there's no guarantee that it's not an $11 billion 10-year deal. We don't know. We don't know at all. As a matter of fact, the only idea we have is that Florida State's athletic director mentions in this video that the SEC teams are averaging at $72 million a year.
And if you look at the numbers there, the Big Ten is projected to distribute about $80 million on average to their members, and the SEC about $72 million on average to their members.
And the big teams are averaging at 80. So we can assume that the deal is relatively close, and so it lasts over 10 years instead of 7, which means the SEC will be in a tough spot in a couple years. We'll get to that. So going to the Big Ten means Florida State would make the most revenue. Now, if you look at the Big Ten from a revenue perspective, this is a great decision for the Seminoles. The revenue there is the best, the TV deals are the best, and the prestige of the conference is probably better than it deserves to be. I feel like there's a lot of Big Ten players and graduates at ESPN, and they push the Big Ten flag harder than they should. I have never felt like the Big Ten is as strong as it's been made out to be. I think they've won 3 national championships since 2000. I might be wrong about that. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments if I am, but I'm pretty sure they've won 3 national championships since 2000, and all of them were won by Ohio State. Meaning the conference isn't exactly strong, they're essentially just the ACC. I mean, with Florida State being replaced by Ohio State. That's essentially what the Big Ten is. I know I already can hear you Penn State fans getting mad at me, and I'm sorry, but you guys have not been in the playoffs. You have not been in the national title game a very long time. Going to the Big Ten would actually work out great for the Seminoles. Florida State would be the third. Right now, if you rip Florida State out of the ACC and put them in the Big Ten, Florida State would be the third highest draw in the conference. And that's without being in the Big Ten, which would build the program's prestige. I do believe Florida State would very quickly pass Michigan and become the second highest draw in the conference. But I think Ohio State might be a tougher nut to crack. But overall, I think the Big Ten's a great decision. So let's look at the on the field. Now, the Big Ten, for the most part, Michigan and Ohio State are it. Now, do I think Florida State would come in and own this conference? No. It takes time. I actually suspect that Florida State would struggle quite a bit their first year in the Big Ten because it takes time. The familiarity that most conference opponents have would take years to build up for the Seminoles. So I would suspect a 7-5, 8-4 finish their first year in the Big Ten. But I would also suspect that about 2 years down the road, Florida State would surpass Michigan as the second best team in the conference and may even surpass Ohio State. But that's tough. The Buckeyes are a legitimate college football superpower. They can compete with anybody on any week. Period. And they have pretty much since I was a little kid. So the Buckeyes are a historically great team. If you look at it from top to bottom, you see the Big Ten is a pretty weak conference. Michigan State has a good year here and there, but really isn't consistent. Purdue is nothing. Illinois is nothing. They're no better. Those two teams are no better than Wake Forest and Syracuse. Florida State would crush them on an average basis. As a matter of fact, if you look top to bottom, it's tough to see a Big Ten team besides Michigan and Ohio State, that would truly consistently challenge Florida State. I'm sorry, Wisconsin fans, I don't think your run-first strategy with a lack of speed on the outside is going to be enough, because putting Florida State in the Big Ten is putting a big Southern school in the Big Ten, and the Big Ten teams have struggled against big Southern schools on national stages for decades now, with the exception of Michigan and Ohio State, who have worked very hard to get the speed on the outside you need to compete with these Southern schools. Now, this move would actually be a huge coup de grace for the Big Ten, especially if they get Clemson to come too. This would allow the Big Ten to break into the southern part of the country. Every team in the Big Ten would become better by comparison. The Big Ten may actually supplant the SEC with this move as the best conference in the country because of the fact that they'll be able to start recruiting in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida, places where they have a tough time recruiting right now because it's tough for them to come all the way across the country and recruit. Because, I mean, I see maybe, us Florida people see maybe a couple Big Ten games a year, and they're normally the big key market games. But you put Florida State and Clemson in the conference and add Miami as well. Now us Florida fans and South Carolina fans and Georgia fans in this region of the country are going to see a ton of those games every year, because we get Miami games, we get Florida State games, we get Florida games, we get Georgia games every week because we're in this part of the country. That'll help so much with Big Ten recruiting in this southern region. It will allow the Big Ten to have substantial control of the southern region. Now, on the downside, however, is the travel distance. Real life is real life, and having to travel across the country every week to play games could put too much of a strain on Florida State, creating an issue where the Noles are not as good as they should be. Having to travel across the country makes it very tough. I mean, NFL teams do it every week, but it's a big ask because, I mean, like Ohio State coming to Tallahassee is a long trip, or vice versa. Although it would be kind of fun to see the Buckeyes become one of Florida State's biggest rivals and be in the Doak every other year. That would be a lot of fun to see. That's something that I don't think a Seminole fans have ever got to say. Overall, personally, I think the Big Ten is probably the best move for Florida State. I don't think it's the one they're going to make, but I think it's probably the best move. It's got the most money. It's the most manageable conference as far as talent. And I believe that Florida State would actually gain national prestige by doing it. Of course, there is the downside of the travel distance. So that brings us to the last option. And this is the one Florida State will choose. I'm not saying think choose. I honestly believe that this will be done in 2024 or 2025. This is where Florida State is going, and that is the SEC. Now, the SEC is objectively the best conference in the sport. It's won 6 or 7 of the last 10 national championships. Alabama is the class of college football, has been the class of college football for the last 20 years, and it looks like they might have been supplanted by Georgia, another SEC team. And even teams like Tennessee, Kentucky, and Texas A&M have good years from time to time where they're really competitive. You see LSU every 4 or 5 years will go and play and win a national championship. So the SEC has some massive advantages. First is prestige. The prestige of the conference is so much that an 8-4 Florida State team in the SEC will receive more respect than a 10-2 team for Florida State and the ACC, which is stupid, but that is absolutely the truth. The SEC does not offer quite as much money as the Big Ten, plus its contract is a little longer. And this could be a problem later, because the Big Ten gets to renegotiate 4 years before the SEC, which, assuming that Florida State, Clemson, and Miami end up in the SEC, although what I think is likely to happen is Florida State and Clemson goes to the SEC, Miami, Virginia Tech, and North Carolina go to the Big Ten or Big 12, which I think will actually help the Big Ten. The Big Ten is going to need something to try to renegotiate that contract in a few years. But the long-term deal of the SEC's contract is actually a little concerning, unless it's one of those contracts that goes up every year. We don't know because the numbers aren't publicized. So I don't know how much you'd make in the SEC. We can only go for what Florida State's athletic director said, which is around $72 million. Now, Florida State would also be the third highest earner in the SEC, just like they are in the Big Ten. This time they're behind Alabama and Georgia. Now, unlike the Big Ten, where I feel like Florida State would almost immediately supplant Michigan and become the second highest earner, I don't think Florida State is immediately supplanting Alabama or Georgia. As a matter of fact, it's more likely that Florida State becomes solidified as the third best SEC team and never is quite able to surpass those two schools. However, Alabama may collapse soon. It seems like they're going that way, although I picked them to win a national championship. But I don't think Saban has too many years left. And when he leaves, don't think Bama's just going to rebound. You don't just rebound from a coach like that. So Alabama will likely become more average. Maybe 7-5, 9-3 may become their average season instead of national championships every 2 years. And when that happens, Florida State will have an opportunity to supplant the Crimson Tide as the second best conference in the country. Florida State plays a lot of SEC schools, and for the most part, the Seminoles have been very successful against the SEC. As a matter of fact, they're the only team in the conference that has really been successful against the SEC in the last 20 years. So, really, Florida State is probably the only ACC team that can survive the SEC, but I think Clemson can handle themselves too. So the SEC is a good destination. The money is better. The prestige is God tier. I mean, you could lose 2 teams in the SEC and still get in the playoffs, especially with the expanded 8-team playoffs. Going to the SEC means Florida State would most likely be in the playoffs every single season. It also means that you won't get that culture shock of going from playing Wake Forest to playing Georgia, where it takes a half of football before you get used to the difference between the two teams. You would actually immediately know who Georgia is because you would have played them 3 weeks ago. Also with Florida... Also, with the collapse of the Gators, I mean, let's face it, the Gators are all laughing stock. This is a team paying $16 million a year to coaches they don't even have anymore. This is a team that cannot win consistently anymore. This is a team that hasn't been a national threat since Urban Meyer left. So this is a team that has kind of failed the SEC in recent years. They really haven't carried that Florida banner. It's become clear to anyone living in this state that Florida is a second-tier team now. This state is owned by the Seminoles, and it has been for a little while now. Now, I know a lot of Florida fans are going to disagree with that, but they're not. If they're being honest with themselves, they will tell you, unless they're living in Gainesville, you've seen more Seminole fans in recent years in Florida than any other team in this state. And to be fair, it's because Florida State has been far more successful over the last 15 years. While I know there was a brief period when Jimbo left with Willie Taggart, there's like a 3-year period where Florida State was bad, then there was COVID, which I don't count that season, throw it away, and then there was Mike Norvell's first real season, the season after COVID, where Florida State was really bad. But actually, if you throw away the COVID season, you'll notice Bobby Bowden's first season, listen to this, guys, because this is crazy. Bobby Bowden's first season was 5-7. Bobby Bowden's second season was 9-3. If you throw the COVID season away, Mike Norvell's first season was 5-7. Mike Norvell's second season was 9-3. If this trend continues, Florida State will have another 30 years of dominance as long as we can keep Norvell long term. Florida State is also building a new athletic facility, as I've mentioned, which will make us the envy of the country for our athletic facilities. This is important in the SEC because you're competing with the very best college football programs. The downside with the SEC is it is a murderer's row. If you look at the teams in the SEC, it's hard to see teams that you can just pencil in easy W's. I mean, Florida State's better than Kentucky, they're better than Vanderbilt, they're better than Arkansas or Auburn, but it's going to be tough because you got to play Tennessee. We already play Florida every year, so who cares? I'd imagine we'll still play Miami because Florida State and Miami have been very adamant about keeping that. I hope Florida State and Miami play that game forever, even if they go to the SEC, because I would hate to lose that game. That's one of the best games in college football. So easy wins are hard to come by in the SEC. Most conferences, you're going to have 3 to 4 easy wins a year. The SEC, you're probably going to have 1 to 2. And I say that I'm not counting the cream puffs that everybody plays, at least once a year. Those are always the jokes, no matter what conference you're in. But you're going to have, out of your 8 conference games in the ACC, 3 of them are probably going to be gimmies. And the Big Ten, out of your 8 conference games, 4 of them are probably going to be gimmies. And the Big 12, out of your 8 conference games, 8 of them are probably going to be gimmies. But in the SEC, out of your 8 conference games, you may get 2 easy ones, and the rest of them are going to be tough. And also, the SEC wants to move to a 9-game conference schedule as they continue to hopefully, in their case, expand to 20 teams, which would be Florida State and Clemson are the teams they want to add. So, personally, I think the SEC is a big risk. The Big Ten, to me, seems like a better option, but the SEC is a big risk. Now, there's some pluses, obviously, recruiting. Florida State would go from top 10, top 5, even sometimes top 3 recruiting, all the way up probably to 1 or 2 every year, because the SEC prestige would help the Seminoles vastly. Even though the SEC is probably the only conference in the country that Florida State doesn't so much raise its prestige as it raises their prestige. Every other conference in the country, the tier Florida State would actually lift that conference up higher, even the Big Ten. But the SEC, Florida State just kind of fits in with a group of very, very good college football programs like LSU, Alabama, and Georgia. And Florida, even though they can't win to save their lives right now. So the Florida State just kind of fits in there. They'd be the 3rd best team in the conference in revenue. That's always a good thing. But what worries me as a Seminole fan is I'm worried about the Big East effect. So when Miami, Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh, and Syracuse killed the Big East, a lot of people, myself included, thought Miami and Virginia Tech would dominate. So much so that they split the conference into 2 sides. They've done away with that now. Again, thanks to the people who pointed that out in my last video. I did not know that either. They've done away with that now. They have no more conference sides. That's why we don't play NC State this year, thank God, or Louisville, thank God. So they were so convinced they split the conference into 2 sides and put the Big East, the best Big East teams, Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, and Miami, on that side, and then put the best ACC teams, Florida State, Clemson, and NC State, on the other side. So essentially, you really had kind of a small Big East and it's in the ACC. And since that's happened, side of the conference, and now it's gone, that side of the conference has really never been any kind of successful. As a matter of fact, probably the most successful team in that side of the conference has been Georgia Tech, who was an ACC team before the Big East teams joined. But the truth of the matter is, Florida State and Clemson have absolutely dominated the ACC, period. I mean, like since Florida State joined, it's been Florida State and Clemson. Normally Florida State, but Clemson deserves tons of respect because they've also been very successful. They've also won more national championships in the 10-year period than Florida State has. And they've been in the playoffs more times than Florida State has. And they've been in the national title game more times in the last 10 years than Florida State has. So right now, the ACC is Clemson's. But Clemson is also only a 9% draw to Florida State's 15%.
So I'll say this just because I wanted to point out that we contribute around 15%. If you us and Clemson account for 24% of the overall media agreement with the ACC.
Which in Florida I think is just a crazy, crazy football state, maybe even a little bit more than South Carolina, although I have never been to South Carolina, so forgive me, folks out there in South Carolina. You guys may be just as crazy as we are, but it doesn't matter. Either way, Florida State is a 11% higher draw than Clemson.
And that's normalizing everything when you measure this. You measure your opponent, TV channel, time, team performance. When you do all that, we draw the best in the ACC.
So since money rules the goddamn world, it's very likely that Florida State will be returning to its ACC dominance. The SEC is probably where Florida State will go. The other question I have, and I don't know this, because the SEC still has conferences, and I don't think the SEC is going to become a big jumble like the ACC did. The other question is, does Florida State go on the side with LSU, Alabama, and A&M? Or does Florida State go on the side with Georgia, Florida, and Florida? I'm thinking one of the two teams, Clemson or Florida State, will go on one side and the other one will go on the other. That will let the SEC have two 10-team divisions, which probably means you won't get a lot of division cross games anymore. I'd imagine most of the games will be inside these own divisions, and then they'll play in what essentially will be a playoff game. I mean, the SEC is basically becoming a sport unto itself by adding in the addition of these two teams if that happens. Also, the SEC may have the actual clout to renegotiate its TV deal if it should want to in 3 or 4 years adding these teams. It's a fair argument to say, hey, look, we've added Miami. We've added North Carolina for basketball. We've added Florida State. We've added Clemson. We've added Oklahoma. We've added Texas. We are the most dominant conference in the sport. The Big Ten is no competitor. And that would be a true statement. Also, if Florida State and Clemson join, the SEC now has all but, I think, one national championship in the last 10 years, and that one was won by Ohio State. Yeah, Ohio State. They beat Oregon. So overall, the SEC is probably the conference that needs Florida State the least. I actually think the conference that needs Florida State the most is definitely the Big 12, but I think the conference that would benefit the most from Florida State is the Big 10. Also, let's talk for a minute about these other teams. So, Clemson has pretty much been clear that if Florida State leaves, they're going, which I don't blame Clemson. Essentially, they'd fall into a black hole since Miami is not the team they're supposed to be and not the team they need to be. Now, I've only recently heard the Miami, North Carolina part of this, so I don't know how true it is. I've heard it in rumors. It seems pretty damn true to me. I don't see why Miami and North Carolina would want to stick around if Florida State and Clemson leave. Now, as Florida State's athletic director mentioned in the video, these conferences are looking to expand, but say the Big Ten adds 4 teams and the SEC adds 2 more teams, and Florida State just has decided still to stay in the ACC. At that point, it becomes very likely that Florida State will be stuck in the ACC because once these conferences expand to 20 teams, I don't believe that they're going to want to expand to 21 or 22, so you're going to be stuck where you are. So Florida State has to make a quick decision while every one of these 3 conferences are, looking for big schools in order to expand. Basically, I don't know if Clemson's going with Florida State. That's what I heard on ESPN, is that Clemson was going to go with Florida State. Essentially, Florida State went to the SEC, Clemson's coming along. Florida State goes to the Big Ten, Clemson's coming along. Florida State goes to the Big 12, Clemson's coming along. This is good for both teams, because if they are negotiating as like a take both of us kind of deal, then that is 25% of the ACC, 24% of the ACC's total revenue, and it's also the 2 biggest football teams in the ACC. So it would be a very, very, very tempting for any conference, any one of these conferences. If Miami and North Carolina also go, although the rumor right now is Miami is thinking about going to the Big Ten, Florida State and Clemson are going to the SEC, and North Carolina, that name just came up recently. I have not heard where they might be going, but I'm going to assume the SEC because I think the Southeastern Conference would love to add the Tar Heels. They're a decent football program, but more than that, they would help the SEC become a more dominant basketball conference. Let's talk about the effects here. For the sake of this, let's consider the fact the Big 12 is not able to pick up Florida State, Clemson, Miami, or North Carolina. For the sake of this video, we're going to say we already know USC and UCLA are going to the Big 10. That raises the Big 10's total teams to 18. The Pac-12 is going out to try to get new members, but let's be perfectly honest, it doesn't matter who they bring in. Losing those two teams leaves the entirety of the conference on the back of Oregon. Because quite obviously, it's just not the same as having USC. USC is the Florida State of the Pac-12. They are the conference's big draw. And I am actually kind of excited as a fan to see some of the matchups in the Big Ten in the future with USC at Michigan. I know they play, but Michigan State and USC. I'm also interested to see if UCLA does better in the Big Ten because they haven't been very good in the Pac-12. It also opens up the LA market for the Big Ten, which is probably part of the reason the Big Ten got such a substantial TV deal. But the Pac-12 is now down as probably its two best earners. If Oregon was to get poached, there's no rumors about that, so we're going to assume that the Pac-12 will limp on as a team, as a conference with Oregon as their strongest football program. And I think that's why I didn't see it. Now, this might have changed by the time this video comes out, but I did not see that the Pac-12 has gotten their deal done. The idea was they were going to try to get their deal done a few months ago in order to have a deal to try to sweeten the pot and convince more teams to come in. But the rumor is the Big 12 might be hunting. If the Big 12 is hunting, this could be a real problem for the Pac-12 because if Oregon goes to the Big 12, you can take and scribble out the Pac-12. It's going to be just like the Big East. It's going to become a non-Power 5 conference. But let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that Oregon stays. What does this mean for the Big 12? Well, the Big 12, for a quite an direct way, is fucked. The teams they're adding from the Group of 5 do not constitute the loss of Oklahoma and Texas. They are absolutely done. Put a fork in it. The Big 12 doesn't even deserve to be a Power 5 school conference anymore. I am shocked they got a TV deal starting in 2025 that runs to 2031 because did they know Oklahoma and Texas were leaving when they signed that deal? Because this is not a football conference anymore. I mean, you saw what TCU did last year against Georgia. This is not what you expect from a Power 5 football conference. 65 to 3? Absolutely unacceptable. The Big 12 is likely, if they can't add Florida State, they can't add Oregon, they can't add Clemson, North Carolina, Miami, most likely this conference is going to go the way of the Big East and will not receive a new TV deal in 2031. Its TV deal will probably become more like the American Conference deal, which is like, I thought it was like $10 million a year for each one of his teams. Let's take a look at the ACC. So for the sake of this video, we're going to consider that Florida State and Clemson are going to the SEC. Just for the sake of this video, Florida State and Clemson are going to the SEC. So, Florida State and Clemson are gone. That leaves Miami, North Carolina, Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh, Georgia Tech, and NC State as decent football teams in the ACC. But with Florida State and Clemson gone, I suspect Miami and North Carolina will also be gone. So let's assume, just because, that Miami and North Carolina go to the Big 12 and Virginia Tech goes to the Big 10. Well, the ACC is a dead conference. It's basically like the Big East. It becomes a basketball conference. What I see happening in the future is I think the ACC is going to go belly up. It's going to become a basketball conference. I think the Big 12 is also going to go belly up and become a basketball conference. It would probably be more like a long death rattle for the Big 12 because it was such a prestigious conference for so long. But I do think the Big 12 is going belly up because the problem is they just don't have the marketable teams right now. The teams they're adding from the Group of 5 do not become marketable teams just because they joined the Big 12. And most likely those teams moved out of the Group of 5 to be re-added to the Group of 5. Now, the ACC can't poach anybody. That's the thing to remember here. The ACC has no money. The TV contract is awful. So the ACC can't poach anybody. So since the ACC can't poach anybody, the ACC is completely done. If Florida State and Clemson leave, the ACC is done. Most likely, Miami, Virginia Tech, North Carolina State, Boston College, and Pittsburgh will all soon follow, going to different conferences, because if they don't, especially Miami and Virginia Tech and NC State, who are national brand names, they all will almost definitely go somewhere else. I don't see them sitting around saying, oh, we just lost our best two teams. Because if you look at every one of these conferences, in spite of how much love they throw at the SEC and the Big Ten and all these other conferences, they're top heavy. Those 2 or 3 teams in all these conferences that are the sheer draw. And the SEC, it's Alabama, Georgia. It's Alabama and Georgia. And the Big Ten is Michigan and Ohio State. And the Pac-12, it's USC and Oregon. And the ACC is Florida State and Clemson. So it's like, and that's what they're doing. They're poaching these top earners. These Big Ten and SEC are poaching these top earners. That way they can bring them in and build super conferences. And I wouldn't be surprised, guys, if in a few years they start forcing out the Vanderbilts and the Illinois, because every time you force a team out, the share for the big schools gets bigger, and you're becoming more like the NFL every day. I mean, you look at the NIL deals. Look at some of these top paid players. I mean, we got quarterbacks like Jordan Travis is making $1.2 million this year. I mean, you got Arch Manning making $3.7 million. This is a professional sport now. And in professional sports, super conferences make sense because it's less about winning in professional sports and more about how much money you can make. And you make more money in these super conferences. And overall, I think that this is a giant mess. The NCAA should have tried to find a way to negotiate a better deal to keep this from happening. So what I think is going to happen is we're going to have 2 21 or 22 team conferences in the Big Ten and the SEC. And truthfully, while we will still have a playoffs every year that will allow teams from other conferences in, none of them will ever get out of the first round. Because that's basically what's happening here. You can change the SEC and Big Ten to the AFC and the NFC. And you can just stick with that because that's basically what's happening now. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. You made it all the way through the video. I greatly appreciate you. I know this was another long one. I'm planning 2 more Florida State videos this month. I hope you guys enjoyed them. We're going to try to do more videos in the future. Check out my channel. I have 4 Florida State videos. I have one on the fall of the Florida State football program and how Mike Norvell brought it back. I have one on the sad, tragic history of Jimbo Fisher and how he went from top-tier coach all the way down to a joke. And I have one predicting the outcome of this year's football season. Anyway, I greatly appreciate you guys making it through all like 15 minutes of this video. Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button. Come back next time.